Hey, all my friends, welcome once again to the Everyday Missionary Podcast. This is episode 316. And today I want to enter into the topic and I want to slow the pace down a little bit, right? So normally I'm like, hey, and here's what we're dealing with. But if you've read the title, instantly you're either listening because you might be like, that's right, go get him, Matt. Or you're listening because you're like, oh, here is where he's a heretic and we're going to come after him. And I know that instantly. Like, I kind of know that the audience that might listen to this podcast might be down one of those two roads. And so I want to try to, as best as I can, settle this down a little bit, because this is not meant to be a gotcha. This isn't really me trying to be like provocative for provocative's sake. It's something that's really been kind of just weighing on my heart. And I've been kind of reading and paying attention and listening a little bit and then trying to distill it down. And then in that, trying to get to the undercarriage of what I think is most important. And in this, maybe I want to ground it in the last podcast, right? So in that one, I talked about the fact that more than being like patriots and pundits, we're meant to be prophets and priests. And the heart behind that was to say, you know what, more than being really beholden to the left or to the right of our culture, the follower of Jesus is always looking for a third way. Or maybe to say it differently, I think the follower of Jesus is required to live it and do it and say it and think it and follow through on it in a third way, because it's really that third way that's probably most representational or representative of authentic holiness in any given culture, right? So let me say this a little bit differently. The word holy means to be uncommon, and we're meant to be an uncommon people. And part of that uncommonness is easily found in just looking at what is common. And in our society, what is common is this idea of the left and the right and the ideologies that drive that. And if there's anything I personally feel that I see on the left and the right, is cherry picking of Jesus. Both sides kind of cherry pick Jesus, and both sides then suppress things that matter to Jesus. So this notion that one camp gets Jesus fully right is not accurate. Neither camp gets Jesus fully right. But the follower of Jesus is supposed to say, you know what, more than, again, bowing to, I'm going to have this kind of patriotism to the left or patriotism to the right, more than saying I'm going to be a pundit to the left or a pundit to the right. I'm going to be super passionate about the left or the right. I'm going to be beholden to the idols of the left or the right. We don't do any of that. Rather, we're saying, all right, how does the way of Jesus inform the world that I'm living in? And what are things that I need to do different than what either side is saying so that I can represent Jesus well in the culture that I'm a part of, right? That's the essence behind this. And so part of what I said in that last podcast is that there are times where we are then, as followers of Jesus, to speak into the things that are happening, and we are to be both prophet-like and priestly in that regard. And I don't mean that in a religious sense. I just mean that when you see things that are contrary to the heart or spirit of God, you speak into those things. But you don't have to be jerky about it. You don't have to be difficult about it. But at the same time, knowing that there's an in-season and out-of-season reality to this, sometimes speaking into those things in the season that you're in can be kind of freaky or scary, or you just get ready. You just tense yourself up, knowing that in saying what is clear to the scriptures, there is going to be like a shove back. And for me, I kind of look at this one, and again, as I kind of said from the beginning, I know that there's going to be like each side of the current social debate is going to be like jockeying for what this podcast is doing. And yet my heart here is to say, hey, these are topics that are really, really prevalent right now. I do think the scriptures speak into these topics, and my concern then, as the heart of both kind of a prophet, meaning somebody that's wanting to speak scripture into these things, and a priest, which is wanting to be a go-between, right, between the things of God and the things of people, I felt compelled to talk about some of these things, right? And so with that, I want to be, again, just as clear as I can. This is not politically motivated. I want to go a step deeper, and I want to speak about President Trump for just a second to say this is really not so much to me about President Trump. In fact, many things that I kind of think through on some of these things, it's less about the president for me, right? Like, in other words, like, everybody kind of knows that the president says what he's going to say and he's going to do what he's going to do. And in some ways, the refreshing thing about the president is you don't wonder like where he's coming from, right? He's like a a blunt instrument. Like, you just know exactly what it's going to do. You know exactly what he said. There's no like, hey, how are you kind of, peeing on my leg and telling me it's raining? Like, he's not like any normal politician. He just is just matter of fact, this is the stuff he's going to do, right? And I know for some, they love it. And for others, they're infuriated by it. But that's not so much my thing today, right? My thing today is how we as Christians engage in this, right? And how we as Christians interpret what's going on, how we as Christians either grieve over what's going on, or we're gleeful about what's going on, and that kind of thing. And that's probably my deeper concern always. Like, for 30 years of pastoral ministry, I've always banged this drum. If you go back and talk to people that were a part of the very first church that I ever pastored as a lead pastor, they will tell you that this was Matt back then too. So this isn't new. Like, I've always been in this space of, I know that Christians kind of get baited into all the social stuff, and then we elevate it to scriptural stuff when it's really not as scriptural as we think. And then sometimes in that quest, we lose sight of the deepest values of God because we're so fixated on the politics or the social implications of a thing. And this is where I think Jesus calls us to be different, like radically different. Like, even for me right now, I'm prepping for the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, if I was to pan the camera just over to my left here, you would see a large sum of books all about the Sermon on the Mount. And for me, again, that's a big go-to. I think for me, the Sermon on the Mount is literally the greatest, not just message. I think it is the greatest articulation, architecture, and map of how we as Christians are to live in this world. And I think it's one of those things that we are more apt to just like put it on bumper stickers and stitch it on pillows and have coffee mugs that have a pithy quote or whatever else. And maybe not taking it as seriously as we could or should. And I think from that, we get in the way of seeing Jesus really transform our society because we actually don't think that quite works. And we turn to these other things. And when we turn to these other things, then we start to get blinded to the stuff that matters most to God. And I think in that we start to publicly say things or condone things or support things that break the heart of God. And I think that's really where my concern is. So people are going to say, oh, this is just whatever it is, President Trump bashing. Absolutely, it's not. It's not that. Is it trying to be prophetic over Christians that are maybe going down roads that I think are counter-scriptural? It is that, but I'm not doing that as a scold. Like, I hope you hear my tone is not scolding. I hope it never becomes scolding in this podcast today. I also hope for those who are like on the same page as me, this doesn't turn into self-righteous amens, as though you're looking at the other side and they just are so blind or dumb or what. Like, don't do that either, right? This goes back to what I said last week. We're to be a different kind of people, right? And I think anytime we see things that breaks the heart of God, that should break our heart too. It shouldn't make us mad. It shouldn't make us angry. It shouldn't cause us to fume and become self-righteous in another way. We should be like, man, that breaks my heart. And then how can I come alongside? How can I help my brothers and sisters, like in that spirit of Galatians 6:1-2, coming alongside in a spirit of gentleness and seeing course correction, right? I think the other part of this that's going to be really, really challenging as I talk about some of this is just the fact that I do think at the core it's about conscience. And because we can have our conscience miswritten, right? So there can be a hardening of conscience or a blinding of conscience or a searing or all those kinds of things. What's going to be hard is there going to be things that some of us hear in this and it just intuitively creates a reaction. And that's because of our conscience kind of still being wobbly in this world. And that's going to be hard. And especially depends on how much we're listening to certain voices. Because I know on both sides of these debates, I think there's a lot of hotness. And with the hotness, if you're listening to a lot of that hotness, it does create that rigidity in us. And I think this is a little bit of a quest for pliability maybe in this podcast today as well. So that's a lot of my heart behind this whole thing. And so what I've titled this was Vilifying Empathy, Mercy, and Foreigners, the Erosion of Christian Conscience. Now, again, I think that automatically is like people's alarms are going to go off, every light on the dash is flashing. What do you mean vilification of? Maybe that's a strong word, but what I find interesting is anything that isn't the celebration of empathy, mercy, and foreigners, like from a scriptural perspective, is kind of running contrary to the grain of what God is doing in the world. Like, God cares about those themes. I'm going to walk through some of those in a minute, highlighting some of the verses that talk about that. But he cares about those things. And when we suppress that, or we shut that off, or we literally say those are bad ideas. And I'm not saying every Christian saying that. I'm certainly not saying everybody that is probably a little bit more on one side of this argument than the other right now, at least in the social discourse. I'm not saying that it's a wholesale shutting down of those things, but when we start to do those things, that's where we should be alarmed, because these are themes that aren't like subtexts of the scriptures. Like these are elevated themes. These are like really, really important themes. And I want to walk through each of these in light of some of this current stuff that's been going on, right? Because there's been current things, right? Both in our own culture, like for us right now living in Duval, Washington, there was a thing this week on social media about our local police department. The chief of police basically was saying, hey, we're not a federal agency. Our job is not to uphold federal laws. Therefore, we will not be engaged in any way with the enforcement of laws as it pertains to undocumented citizens or undocumented peoples here in our city limits. We're not going to do that, right? And of course, then on social media, there's love and hate going around on that, but that's one of those things. And so again, for our little world, that's a thing. Recently, on the inauguration of the president, there was a bishop that gave a sermon, and from that, there was a lot of feelings on both sides of that sermon. And so kind of bringing all of that into this discussion as well and highlighting those things. And again, having to remember that sometimes we may not always care for the messenger, we may not always care for the methodology, but we don't want to, in having those struggles, undermine the actual message of the scriptures that counts in all of this. So that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm trying to speak into a high temperature thing. I'm trying to lower temperature, but at the same time, honor what I think the scriptures point to, so that our consciences don't become hardened in the process. And then we lose mission for the sake of just whatever it is, political ideology or social friction or whatever. Like we just want to do it different, right? So again, I'm not here to scold, but I am here to hopefully press and enlighten and say, man, when we start to vilify things that God wants to glorify, we are on the wrong side of what God is up to. And that's where I'm always, just as a person that wants to shepherd and guide and lead and speak out of season, which this may be out of season because this is an evangelical podcast, but I just want to say, hey, let's be aware, right? Let's be aware. So hopefully my tone is going to carry some of the day. It's probably going to fail at some point, but I want to kind of understand this a little bit. So I want to start with the first idea, with empathy. And I start there because for the last few years, I've been hearing out of certain Christian camps within the evangelical world this idea of the sin of empathy. And I have to admit, this is the weirdest thing for me, like this idea that empathy is sin. Now, I guess in a very broad sense, you could make anything sin if you wanted to, but at the core of empathy, here's the definition of empathy: the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. The ability to understand and share the feelings of another. That's empathy, right? And it has some derivative to sympathy, and people get into like the nuances of the two, and I'm not going to get into that here, but I just hear that. And I've been hearing people recently that say, hey, if you are empathetic toward undocumented peoples, or if you're empathetic toward certain social communities that are maybe out of favor with either God or people, depending on how you look at it, then you're somehow sinning because you're showing empathy. And I think there's a couple of things in order that need to be talked about. First of all, empathy, it probably can't be a sin if it's a thing that is expected by the heart of God and is commanded to the people of God, right? So, for example, Romans chapter 12, verse 15, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. See, that is the embodiment of empathy, right? That's just the embodiment. And we don't have the freedom to go, well, I'm going to rejoice with the people that I like. I'm going to weep with the people that I like, but I'm not going to weep with the people that I don't like. Because at the core of God's ultimate commands is to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. And when that is said in the book of Leviticus, God's like, not just love your Israelite neighbor, but love your foreign neighbor as well. That kind of covers all of the bases. So in that sense, we are also do have a sense of empathy. We are to weep with those who weep. whether they are of us or not of us. And we are to rejoice with those who rejoice, whether they're of us or not of us. And where that's pertinent to today is the fact that, as we'll get into with the bishop that had the speech on Inauguration Day, there are many people that are weeping. There are many people that are worried. There are many people that are afraid. And as a follower of Jesus, who's commanded by God to have a sense of empathy to those who are in that space, we have to think that way too. So if we're just cold and say they're getting their own, it's on them, whatever else, they snuck in the country, you name the thing, right? They choose this sinful life, whatever else. Like if we fail to want to cultivate that ability to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep, then we're kind of just saying that the first greatest commandment of love God and love our neighbor, which includes even our enemy, which includes the outsider neighbor as much as the insider neighbor, then we're literally saying the first commandment isn't for us. And Romans 12 isn't for us. That's a different context, different condition. I don't need to do that. But again, this is where, again, I think the challenge, this is something I will confess of all Christians tend to negotiate with the scriptures. We pick and choose all the time. Like every group does. Most groups say we revere all the scriptures, but we're all inclined to pick and choose, right? Our scriptures. And nobody's immune from that. I'm not immune from that. I'm just telling you now, like anybody that says they don't pick and choose, they're probably not looking honestly in the mirror, because we all tend to pick and choose. Every theological system is a system of picking and choosing. The Calvinists are picking and choosing. The Arminians are picking and choosing. You know, you name it, right? The conservatives do pick and choose. The liberals do pick and choose when it comes to theology and doctrine and scripture, and we elevate these ones and demote those ones. That is just the challenge of being human with this organic, robust, challenging scriptures document library that God has given to us, right? But in this, we know first commandment is to love our neighbor, outsider, insider. And then Romans says to rejoice with them, to weep with them, insider, outsider, doesn't matter. How about Philippians chapter 2, verse 4? Let each of you look out not only for your own interests, but also the interests of others, right? So this is another one of those things where that's empathy, right? It's like, I care about what's going on with you. I feel what you feel. I ache with how you ache. Like it's just that, really, it's the imprinting of your heart into my heart and vice versa. That's the way that Jesus is wiring us to be and calling us to do. And I have found many times that the people in my life that are followers of Jesus that made the biggest impact on me are the people who do that thing, who go, man, I'm taking an ownership of where you're feeling, where your soul is heavy, and I'm coming alongside you in that, and I'm sharing in that heaviness. I am sharing even the load with you to show how much I love you. Like, that whole essence is so powerful right there, right? How about this reality about what Jesus does for us, and I think how we're supposed to duplicate this out of Hebrews chapter 4. So then, this is chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses. Jesus knows what it's like, right? He faced all the same testings that we do, yet he did not sin. So from this, what's it say? Let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God, and there we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, you know what? I empathize, right? I get it. I lived it. I felt it. I know how tough it is to be a human. I didn't falter in sin. I didn't give in to my temptation. But he's like, man, I get why you do, which is why then he says, so approach me with boldness. Isn't that wild? He doesn't say, approach me sheepishly, right? Approach me with your tail between your legs and no sense of coming with a sense of hope. No, he's like, no, you come boldly to me because I know what it's like to be you. That's empathy. And if we're to be like Jesus, right? Because that's what 1 John chapter 2 tells us. If you really claim to love God, you really claim to obey God, then you're going to look like Jesus. You're going to live your life like Jesus. And what did Jesus say? He said, if you're weary, come to me, right? All who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Why? Because I'm gentle and lowly in heart. The gentle and lowly in heart is seen when he would look at the crowds and he would have compassion, right? He would look at somebody that's oppressed or sick, and his heart would just break, and he would sigh in his spirit. All of that is empathy. And so we as followers of Jesus, if we're embodying Jesus in our world, then we cannot start to see empathy as a sin. Rather, we see it as a salve, right? We see it as a thing that people need most from us. Who else is going to do it? right? Who else is going to do it? If you've been touched by God, you have the Holy Spirit dwelling in you, who produces the fruit of the Spirit and a different way of seeing the world, then all the more what we need to be for everyone is the source of empathy. And if we go on social media and we don't sound empathetic, if we say things to people that lack a spirit of empathy, if our inner person just looks at certain categories and crowds and we're like, they get what they deserve, I don't care, they're trash, whatever thing that we might think in our mind, we are very much outside of the lane of Jesus. We are outside of that narrow and difficult way that he calls us to. And we should note that it's narrow, it's difficult, right? To have empathy to all is difficult. Right? Doesn't matter if you're on the left, having empathy toward the right is difficult. If you're on the right, having empathy toward the left is difficult. If there are subgroups in our culture that you don't agree with, empathy is difficult. Now, empathy doesn't require us to completely, just disown the notion that there's difference, to disown the notion that there's problem. But again, part of the path of seeing people moved out of their problems is people coming alongside them in love and empathy to shoulder life with them and then show them a different way of life. And I think that's the stuff of the kingdom. That's the stuff that Jesus is promoting in the Sermon on the Mount. It's why we go extra miles and turn other cheeks and we don't judge and we worry about our own plank and not their speck. All that stuff comes back to there is no greater way that we are going to see others become followers of Jesus than we are modeling what it means to follow Jesus as we come alongside other people. And I believe that takes a great measure of empathy and where people are at. When Jesus is hanging out with all of the island and misfit toys, if you will, even that hanging out is empathy. When he's eating and drinking with them and laughing and just chilling, that's all. Like, I want to be in your world, in your space. Part of that is the spirit of empathy. I think empathy has another layer to it. And this is the other thing that I'm hearing kind of get beat up a little bit right now. And it's the very notion of mercy. Mercy, right? You would think as followers of Jesus, there would be almost nothing we revere more, like mercy and grace, which have some kind of cousin relationship there. But you would think that we would be the most apt to celebrate encouragements of mercy anywhere that they are labeled. Now, here's where I found myself brokenhearted. And I get how this happens. I get why it happens. I think sometimes, I think I said this earlier in the podcast, it's tough to separate messenger from message. And so we automatically go, if the messenger in my mind is X, then the message is invalidated, right? I don't think we should do that. All truth is God's truth, wherever it comes from. God would raise up, Gentile prophets to preach against Israel. God raised up Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, to deal with the sins of Israel. I think God will raise up all sorts of people. Now, I'm not saying that what I'm about to read comes from that source. People can debate that all they want, but I just simply go, whether you love or dislike the message was a good message. It was an honest message. It was, I think, even like a vulnerable message. And I was saddened to see how many followers of Jesus were not really absorbing the message. And so this was from, I think it's pronounced Marianne Edgar Bundy. This was the bishop, the Episcopal bishop that spoke at the president's inauguration later in the day, right? And it got all kinds of buzz because the president felt it was inappropriate and demanded an apology. I've seen a lot of evangelical leaders online kind of bashing this message. I'm just going to read what she said. All right. So again, this is all I'm doing is just reading what she said. And then I'll just comment maybe throughout. And I'm not doing the whole message that she had, but I want to highlight this because again, I think sometimes even our partisanship can be also in relationship to religion, right? We have religious partisanship. So some people are like, she's an Episcopal, they're a bunch of liberals, that doesn't count. So her message is invalidated. And yet when I listen and then I slowed down and I read it and I thought, man, is this untrue and is this unwise? That's the two things I really try to run it through the filter of. And so this is her final plea. She says, let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you, and as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. I think that's pretty generous because he did say, I believe that God has spared my life for this reason. That's about as close as you can get to the idea that says, I am here for a providential purpose. So in that sense, I think she says something encouraging and positive to the president. She then says, in the name of our God, I ask that you have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. Now, I go back to the previous thing on empathy, and you weep with those who weep and you laugh with those who laugh. And I remember in 2016, there was a similar thing where when President Trump entered into the Oval Office, there was a lot of fear on the part of a lot of people. Now, we could debate whether those fears are real or artificial, they have validity, or they're just overblown. Like, you could debate that. But fear for people is fear for people. As much as in the previous administration, I knew of Christians that were just very, very fearful of President Biden, and they had all of these, kind of concerns about X, Y, and Z. And now we are here 4 years later, and we're all alive, and seemingly nothing terrible has really happened to our culture or country, right? We're always going to have these things where each side is going to have their fears, right? Understandable. But as followers of Jesus, we are to be thinking about the fact that, hey, when people fear, I should care, because I should be caring about other people. I should be weeping with those who weep. And I think she's correct. There are many people that are fearful, right? And you could be on the right side of this, and you're supportive of the current administration, and you go, they're just dumb and they have nothing to fear. And I go, well, some of them are losing their lives right now. And I don't mean physically. I mean, like, they're being removed from what they've known for some length of time, and they're being deported back to their home country. That will create fear for people. There are people that think they're going to have their kids removed for them. If you've ever been a parent and you've ever feared like CPS was going to come in, or you feared the government was going to do something with your family, for these families, that's precisely what they're facing. The government is coming in and taking them from their homes and maybe separating them from their kids, and that is an understandable fear. And as followers of Jesus, we should at least be able to say those are real kinds of fears. Those are real fears for those people. There are real consequences to things that are occurring. And that, instead of us being like, they're getting what they deserve, we should be like, man, my heart breaks with those who are breaking because they're fearful, right? They're scared now. There's just a lot of people that are scared. Then she continues, there are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. Now, I know for many of us listening, you may go, that's just dumb, right? Here's what I know. I have a gay kid. Here's what I know. I have a couple of friends that have transgender kids. And if you think they don't live in a different level of fear or heaviness or feeling that they live in the shadowlands of the rest of society and things are different for them, I just implore you to realize that it is very different. And when you're a radical minority, right? Because again, you look at that community, it's a radical minority of people. I don't mean all of the debates and culture. I'm just talking about the families who, for whatever reason, God has deposited these people in those families' lives, and those families have to navigate those realities. It is a unique challenge for both child and parents and family. It is a unique burden that most will never understand. So when people, either way, they're super defensive of or they're super attacking of, either way, I'm like, there's still millions of Americans that live in the middle of all of that. And I think you just don't understand the magnitude of what they go through. You don't know what it's like for those families for years to open their child's bedroom door every morning and hopeful that they didn't take their life that night. Like that's a reality for many of these parents and many of these families and many of these kids and many of these kids that go, I don't know how I'm going to be received. I don't know what it's going to mean for me. It's a real challenge. And so that's just kind of there. And therefore, kind of as followers of Jesus, all the more we should be the people that show the greatest kind of mercy in those conditions. And so I think the appeal there is just saying, hey, there are people, some who are fearing for their lives. That's not an untrue statement. There are some that really go like, hey, this could be my life. Now, I don't believe it's that elevated personally, right? I don't believe that. But there are people that do believe that. And so, again, I think the call for mercy is what's being asked here. It's not asking for, again, radical changes of policy to A, B, or C. It's just saying, have mercy in these contexts. Then the bishop goes on. The people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meatpacking plants, who wash the dishes after we eat at restaurants and work the night shift in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. This is true, right? And I love the fact that she acknowledges, like, yes, this is true. They also don't have the proper documentation. They don't have the right citizenship status. But, like, as soon as we say they're illegal and therefore they're criminal, we kind of conflate then, like, I read a thing recently that said the average American commits 3 felonies a day, right? I'm glad that we're not all getting arrested for all the stuff that we do. In other words, it's like we may be breaking laws, but it doesn't automatically equate to what we associate with the word criminal, right? So in other words, I live in a town where the speed limit right down the middle is 30 miles an hour. All arterial roads are 25 miles an hour. 31 is illegal. 26 is illegal, right? So if I'm going 31 miles an hour down Main Street of Duval, does that make me a criminal? Or does that mean I'm just breaking the law by a mile an hour? I understand that there's some nuance in there, but it's trying to get that point that there are many people that, yes, they are here under the things that are illegal, but it doesn't automatically elevate them to the status of, quote, criminal. And I think we kind of do that a little bit as though they're menaces to society. There are certainly menaces to society, citizen and non-citizen. Then address the menacing thing for sure. And this isn't a discussion of policy again. It's just our attitude toward these things. And when we kind of roll this together as though, hey, people that aren't causing any trouble are just as dangerous as people that are causing trouble, I think even misses God's notions of justice a little bit and what it means to be truly just and kind of met out the difference between those things, right? And so she says the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay their taxes and they're good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques and synagogues and temples. The list goes on. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away. Again, just asking you to have mercy. Not a bad message. And that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands and to find compassion and welcome here. That is not outside of the scope of things that God cares about, right? Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were once strangers in the land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to spark the truth, to speak the truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and with our God for the good of all people. Good of all people in this nation and the world. Amen. Right? And that's the close of it. And again, even there, the idea that, you know what, that we would honor the dignity of every human being is a profoundly scriptural truth, right? Every person bears the image of God. You see that page 1. And when Jesus rolls in and talks about the final exam at the end of everything, what's he say? He says, I was what? I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was imprisoned and you visited me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me, right? Like all of that's there. And then to some, they go, hey, when did we do that? He goes, well, when you did it to the least of these in this world, you did it to me. But then there's a whole other group where he says, but you didn't do this. And they're like, when did we not care for you and feed you and welcome you as the stranger? And he goes, well, when you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me. The great warning that Jesus does us a favor of right off the bat is he like, listen, man, the stranger is me. The foreigner is me. The outcast is me. The refugee is me. The child is me, right? Whatever, like he's like, that's me. And when you don't do it to them, you're not doing it to me. But if you do it to them, you're doing it to me. I get probably a little stronger there because it's so like Jesus is blunt. Like he's just so red letter blunt there. Like, here's what it is, man. Life and death hangs in the balance of how you treat others in my name because I reside in them, because my image resides in them. Like, it's so powerful. And so this is why when I listened to that speech, it wasn't saying, Mr. President, your policies are sinful and you are wrong and I'm confronting you now and shame on you. It's a plea to mercy. It's a plea to empathy. It is a plea to seeing the image of God in all people. And it's a plea to say, man, you know what? We are called to care for the other because God cared for us as others at one time too. So this is just, again, kind of the heart of Jesus and all of these things, right? Besides, what's to say in Micah 6:8? It's a fascinating little section, right? So the nation has gotten off the rails. Much of the way the nation has gotten off the rails, this is Israel, is they stop caring for the poor and they stop caring for the widow and they don't like the outsider and the foreigner and the stranger and they're doing their own thing and they're all captivated by their own sense of religion or whatever it is. And now God's confronting them. He's like, man, you guys have been wrong at many different levels. Now, the trick is for Israel, they thought they were right. They thought they were religious. They thought they were spiritual. They thought they were godly. They thought they were all those things. And God's like, you're not. You're not. And then it goes a step further. And he's like, hey, I'm confronting you now. And you're probably wondering, what can we do to fix stuff? Should we give a bunch of offerings? Should we kill a bunch of rams and goats and sheep and all that stuff? Should we spill a bunch of blood to show how sorry we are? And God's like, man, here's the bottom line. He says, no. He says, oh, people, the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you. You want to make it right when you've been wrong, then do what is just. To do what is just, which isn't simply the same idea as fulfill the justice of the law of the land. He's like, no, do the right thing. Do the true right thing. When you read this idea of just or righteous or righteousness or justness throughout the Hebrew scriptures, it is this idea of doing right by others and doing right by God. And a lot of times it's toward the least of these. It's toward the poor, right? It's toward caring for those who don't have power to care for themselves, especially people with power, with prestige, with position, there to use that for the betterment of others. And so he's saying, here's what I want you to do. I want you to be just. Next, I want you to love mercy. Love mercy. When anybody celebrates mercy, love mercy. And then to walk humbly with your God. That means teachable, right? Because God is always going to be lovingly confronting us, and we want to be humble enough to go, yep, you're right, I'm wrong, and I know what you want me to do, right? Jesus, you made it clear. If I do it to the least of these, I do it to you. If I am unwilling to do it to the least of these, if I mock the least of these, if I'm against the least of these, if I belittle the least of these, I am doing that to you. Help me to stay humble and to be what you want me to be. Like, that's the heart behind this whole thing, right? So it is to show empathy. It is to love mercy. And then a lot of this was related to the discussion of the foreigner, right? And this is the most interesting one to me, right? And again, I'm not trying to make a big thing about this, except to the degree, like, again, I get that the country needs policies, and I'm not trying to advocate like, hey, you don't have a border thing, you don't have any policy at the border, and this isn't, again, not a policy argument for me. It's a dispositional argument on the part of followers of Jesus that we should have a certain disposition, and therefore we should want solutions in relationship to the disposition that God cares about. We should want policies in relationship to the things that God says are important to him, right? And so there's this great passage in Deuteronomy chapter 10. It says, for the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords. He is the great God, the mighty and awesome God who shows no partiality and cannot be bribed. So he's just letting you know, like, hey man, I do my own thing. He ensures that orphans and widows receive justice. He shows love to the foreigners living among you, and he gives them food and clothing. So you too must show love to foreigners, for yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. Now, I know how we can get rid of that super easy. That was Israel. That's the Old Testament. Doesn't count, right? But it shows the heart of God, right? Because he's going out of his way. He's ensuring that orphans, widows receive justice. He shows love to foreigners, right? He gives them food and clothing. So you too must ... right? And I think that's a powerful passage. It really is. In fact, if you even look at the 10 commandments, if somebody says, well, the 10 commandments are for today. Fourth commandment, Sabbath, right? You read it in Deuteronomy. It talks about, hey, you give rest to the foreigner as much as you give rest to the Israelite, and you give rest to your animals as much as you give rest to your kids, right? And so there was always this thing from the Decalogue, which is the 10 commandments, the core identity of Israel, all the way through Deuteronomy that says, hey, this is the group you care about. And I think God does this because it's very easy to care about your own and be less considerate about those who are not your own. This is why even in Leviticus, the command to love your neighbor is that reminder, love your Israelite neighbor and love your foreign neighbor as yourself, right? And he doesn't let him off the hook. He doesn't say you get to love the foreigner less than you love the Israelite. And I think for us as followers of Jesus, knowing that Jesus builds off of the Mosaic law in a brighter, bolder, more brilliant way, he's like, hey man, that kind of love, you have to go even deeper with it. Which is why then he gives the whole thing about even loving your enemies and doing good to them and praying for them and blessing them when they curse you and hate you and against you and everything else. And so this idea of caring about that matters to the heart of God. So we don't want to just write that off, because I feel like that is the risk of some in the evangelical world right now, is they're like, this is dumb, this doesn't count, we just got to get them out, they're breaking the law, they're whatever. And we're forgetting that, like I think about the book of Acts. Remember, the apostles are commanded to not preach about Jesus. And they're like, hey, I don't know how to break this to you guys, but we have to obey the heart of God over the laws of men. And I think there's a little bit of a parallel here where it's like, I'm not saying that we have to, again, have this big diatribe against policies right now or whatever else. But we should have a heart that says, you know what is the most humane way to do this? What is the most caring way to do this? Like, honestly, I was thinking about this, knowing in our own area where there are some of the federal enforcement officials coming and doing either like raids or checking of status or whatever it is. And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing as followers of Jesus if we were in those spaces to pray with those people as they were being arrested or detained or whatever else? Like, we can go into prisons. I don't know if we can do this too. But again, to be on site where it isn't like they're getting their own and that's right, ship them out. But it's like they're afraid their life is going to get radically changed. And we love and care for them. And we want to come alongside them in whatever way we can and show the love of Jesus to them, as much as then saying, hey, we should care about the stuff that Jesus cares about. We should care about the heart of God as it pertains to this. And in the same way, God was like, you feed them and you clothe them and you care for them and you seek justice for them. It's kind of that same idea out of Deuteronomy. Again, I get the murkiness of policy and we're all going to debate those things and everything else, but there's a heart that's kind of in there. And I think we have that heart because there's another warning, not from the old Hebrew scriptures, but from the new Christian scriptures out of the book of James that I think is pertinent even to maybe what we want to think about as followers of Jesus that are generally, from all global scale, affluent. Evangelicals uniquely are more affluent on average in our culture. There's been a lot of documentation on that. And then we care about the scriptures and think it's the word of God for us. And so we want to take it seriously. There's this passage in James 5. And he says this starting in verse 1. He says, look here, you rich people. So he's talking to followers of Jesus, right? Look here, you rich people, because James is to followers of Jesus. He says, weep and groan with anguish because of all the terrible troubles ahead for you. Your wealth is rotting away, and your fine clothes are moth-eaten rags. Your gold and silver are corroded. The very wealth that you are counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. The corroded treasure you have hoarded will testify against you on the day of judgment. For listen, hear the cries of the field workers whom you've cheated out of their pay, the cries of those who have harvested your fields. They've reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies. You've spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying your every desire. You've fattened yourselves for the day of slaughter. You have condemned and killed innocent people who do not resist you. Now, I don't read that with a particular agenda. I just read it as a very insightful reminder, right? That when we are in positions of affluence or luxury or power comparative to others, and we have enjoyed some of what we have on the backs of others, and then we all the more mistreat those who have done that for us, we may be flirting with the problem of James chapter 5, right? And that's just a possibility. I'm not saying it's a reality. I'm not saying it's you. I'm just saying we're supposed to look at the scriptures as a mirror and then ponder ourselves accordingly, right? Like that's going to be the essence of what we're supposed to do. And so again, I raise this because as I see some of the tone and I see some of the temperament going on, and I see sort of this almost celebratory gotcha, or finally they're getting their own, or whatever. Like there's like a cavalier callousness that I think hurts the conscience of Christ in us. Like it can corrode the conscience of Christ in us. So as I said from the beginning, this isn't really about policy. This isn't really about what side of the political spectrum you fall on. This is really about how do we bring Jesus to bear on what we're called to do, right? Like that's the thing. And I think if you're really acting like Jesus in the world, there's going to be two things that happen simultaneously. Both the left and the right are probably not going to love everything you're representing. And at the same time, you're going to be bringing Jesus in a way that neither the left or the right can accomplish, right? That's going to be the heart behind this whole thing. I think part of it means, hey, we are to just be asking for a different disposition of the Spirit in all that we do. We're to work with different priorities. We are not to be, again, kind of idolizing and demonizing this side to that side. We're to be like Jesus. We're to have the heart of God. We are to love mercy. We are to display empathy, both for the insider and the outsider, for the citizen and the foreigner, not because Matt says that, but because God says that, because the scriptures say that, because Jesus modeled that, and that's what is expected of us as we follow after him. That's how we can be the difference makers. Our culture doesn't get better. It doesn't get stronger. It doesn't get more flourishing by working outside of the things of Jesus. Not in the long term. You can in the short term, certainly. But that's why every kingdom is risen and fallen, right? It's all operated under different rules. But Jesus is calling us to embrace a kingdom, to share a kingdom, to advance a kingdom, to display a kingdom that is radically different than the kingdoms of this world. So this is where my encouragement is to all of us as everyday missionaries. Don't get baited into all the bait on the left and the right. Rather, be motivated by Jesus, right? Be motivated by what Jesus seeks for us. And I believe if we can do that and do that faithfully and keep ourselves in check and not get too worked up this way or that way and too agitated over things, but kind of holding the course and gracious love and merciful, empathetic compassion for all, I believe if we do that, we will be effective everyday missionaries.